Ken works for American Rivers as the Associate Director of the Colorado Basin Program. He's the environmental representative on the Colorado River Basin Roundtable and on Colorado Mesa University's Ruth Hutchins Water Center's Advisory Council. Welcome, Ken.
I work for American Rivers, which is the nation's leading river conservation organization. We're an organization that strives to protect rivers in their free-flowing state, and I'll admit I know a lot more about rivers than I do about energy. But there is a significant and complex link between rivers, water, and energy. The most obvious and visible connection is generating electricity, either through hydropower or with large fossil fuel-driven generating plants. These large power plants have recently surpassed agriculture as the largest single use of water taken out of rivers in the US. Water is taken from rivers both to generate the steam that drives the turbines, as well as to cool. To be fair, nearly all of that water is returned to the rivers, although not usually in the same condition it was when removed. Hydropower is often brought up as both a reasonable and clean source of energy. If by clean you mean carbon-free, you're mostly right. Not entirely, but mostly. But there are myriad adverse impacts to rivers from hydropower. Traditional hydropower is not clean. Ask the tens of millions of salmon that used to ply the great rivers of the Pacific Northwest. Small and moderate hydropower using technologies developed more than a century ago are equally devastating to the rivers and streams they're built on. Fortunately, the damage these old-fashioned hydro projects caused is being recognized. We are now in a place where we are removing dams, freeing rivers, and restoring lost connections. That doesn't mean hydropower can't be a viable option for renewable energy. It can and should be an important part of the carbon-free energy portfolio. But it must be done right. It makes no sense to continue damaging or destroying the ecosystems most affected by climate change. Those very ecosystems that we are trying to save by switching to renewables. Pouring vast amounts of concrete to transform rivers into lakes will not solve our problems with climate change. However, smaller, localized hydro projects utilizing existing infrastructure can be a valuable part of the renewable energy solution. Water delivery systems in cities, irrigation systems for agriculture, refitting existing dams, all have significant potential for delivering renewable hydroelectric power. A less visible connection that affects all of us even more closely than having clean energy is this. It's my one prop rather than a PowerPoint. I need some. It takes a lot of energy to make this glass of water and the water in front of you acceptable by modern standards. It takes even more energy to make it acceptable for putting it back into the environment. Energy for water and wastewater treatment is usually the single biggest cost for municipalities and utilities. Industrial uses of water and energy are also large. The internet requires tremendous energy to run and house the massive servers that support it. It also takes a large amount of water. Modern manufacturing processes, from microchips to cars and clothes, take vast amounts of water. Agriculture, obviously, requires both energy and water, not just for irrigation, but also to pump water from deep, non-renewable aquifers using water-generated electricity. It takes a lot of water and energy to raise hay in the desert. And then there's fracking. I'm sure there's been talk about fracking and fossil fuel energy here. Fracking has made the US a net exporter of oil. It has kept energy costs of this country very low compared with other nations. But it comes with a price. First, it takes as much as 5 million gallons, 15 acre-feet or more to frack a single well. 1 acre-foot, almost 326,000 gallons, is enough water to supply 2 average households for a year. Now multiply that by the tens of thousands of wells in Colorado alone. And each one of these wells has to be fracked several times. That's a hell of a lot of water to be pushing into the ground in an arid and rapidly growing region where water supplies for the future are still uncertain. To give you an idea, there are 41,000, a little over 41,000 producing wells in Colorado today, out of 106,000 total. If those take 15 acre feet, that's over 600,000 acre feet. That is the projected water supply gap that the recently published Colorado Water Plan is trying to meet and address by the year 2050. Something to think about. Second, the fluid that goes down a well is a toxic mixture of water, chemicals, and sand. That injected cocktail needs to come back out after it has hydraulically expanded the pores and fractures to release the oil and gas. Often it brings other nasty stuff with it, stuff that perhaps is better left buried. Hydraulic fracturing, by and large, takes good water and turns it into a toxic broth of hazardous waste. Fracking fluid can be recycled, it can be used over again, but eventually it reaches a point where it has to be disposed of, removed and isolated to protect us from the poison it has become. And the fractures being opened are not always confined by the impermeable layer of rock separating the oil-bearing strata from the aquifer people sink their wells into. Operator error or even deliberate neglect, along with spills, can also cause considerable harm to both shallow groundwater and surface water systems. Personally, I can't think of a worse way to waste water, especially in the arid West. But we also need to remember that this is a societal choice. Do we want to conserve and use that water for other more essential needs like drinking and growing food, or do we want cheap energy? It's a lifestyle choice. We choose by how we live and by how we spend money on energy and the many products that demand it. They are choices too often made with little thought. Why should someone living in the heart of Denver or New York City worry themselves with the abstract notion of a farmer's or a small town's water supply either drying up or becoming unusable? They are disconnected and don't understand the links between them, the energy source, the water, or the distant and unknown community affected. The connecting web may be invisible, but it's there nevertheless. The other missing connections here is with water itself that we have here in the glass and the river it comes from. Contrary to common belief, water does not come from a faucet. It comes from a well or a river, most often a river. We have become too comfortable with water as a cheap and reliable resource. We literally don't give it, where it comes from or what it takes to deliver it, a second thought, if any thought at all. While preparing this talk, I looked at countless diagrams, graphics, and illustrations trying to depict the water energy nexus. Lots of arrows and boxes, circles, squares, obscure terms, and flowcharts. There are literally hundreds of illustrations showing the complex maze of connections between water and energy. Some of these graphics even show rivers, but they don't show them as rivers. We tend to compartmentalize our thinking about issues such as energy and water. Too often we fail to see the larger picture, the other complex systems we depend on and that are unwittingly affected by too narrow a focus. I'm not implying that the issue of water and energy isn't complex. It is, but we need to recognize that it is even more complex than we think. We generally see rivers as conduits for the delivery of water, a natural channel from which we can take water for all of our various needs and wants. Energy, agriculture, and domestic water needs are no small matter, but how we satisfy those needs can have significant repercussions. Rivers are incredibly intricate and complex systems. We tend to see just the water flowing in the channel as the whole river, but the real river is much larger. It includes the larger floodplain and riparian areas, as well as the deeper, connected alluvial aquifer through which the channel flows and moves with time. When looking at a river, we need to see all of this: the hydrology, the topography, the fluvial geomorphology, intricate underground connections, the biology both in and out of the water, the chemistry, temperature, and soils. We have to look at it over time as well. The seasonal hydrograph, flood events, drought, the shifting channel within the floodplain, vegetation succession, and the larger watershed for which the river is the living heart. We need to pay attention to the full dynamic, complex, and functioning ecosystem that is a river. The river ecosystem's ability to cope with climate change lies in its resilience, a resilience that depends on its full range of health and ability to function in ways we are just beginning to understand. Reservoirs, large and small, flood important river habitat and alter flows in ways that can greatly affect the river downstream. They can affect temperature and water chemistry, change the physical and geomorphic process, and block vital connections for migrating fish, insects, and wildlife. They can transform an incredibly complex ecological system into a comparatively simple engineered plumbing system with far-reaching consequences. Yes, we've gained tremendous benefits, but we've also suffered tremendous losses. We also have to keep in mind why we need to press for renewable energy and end our dependence on carbon-based fossil fuels. Climate change is the overarching reason, but it is what a changing climate is doing to us and the wider world of natural systems in which we live, of which we are a part, and on which we depend. River systems worldwide are among the most valuable and most vulnerable, and they are already being hard hit from climate change. Water is more than a simple resource. That we can just take for granted. Whether it is for energy, food, or lifestyle, water is very simply life itself. Living organisms can exist without air, even in the near vacuum of space, but nothing on this planet lives without water. Nothing. As such, water is inherently sacred, as are the rivers that provide it. We can use it for our needs, but we can no longer afford to misuse it or its sources. By 2050, there are expected to be 9 billion more people on this planet total. The population of Colorado is expected to double. Climate change will by then have significantly altered weather and precipitation patterns. The hotter and drier climate expected will mean less water in the rivers to meet not only our wants, but those needs of the rivers and the watersheds as well. Energy and water are deeply intertwined, and water, while renewable, is still finite in time. Drought is teaching us that right now. So when we work to solve the energy problems and expand into renewable, carbon-free sources, let's keep in mind the other complex systems on which we all depend. We need to act responsibly, as if all lives depend on it, not just human lives, as we move into an uncertain future markedly different from anything we've known in the past. And we've got 1 minute left if there are any questions.
Hi, I'm Bill Stetson. I used to work for the Connecticut River Watershed Council, and then we created something called River Watch Network with Lawrence Rockefeller. We merged that with River Network because we were doing the similar work, which doesn't often happen, that two environmental groups actually decide to merge. They're now based in Boulder. And back in the day, this is 30 years ago, I worked a lot with New England Power in bringing back the Atlantic salmon. And as you know, that $150 million project largely failed. It's now seems to be improving a little bit. But we also were talking to them about more healthy dams, and these are large dams on the Connecticut River. And I'm just wondering what the future is. Do we continue to take half of them down like in Maine, or is there a way to create a healthier ecosystem, maybe with utilizing some sort of run-of-river entity to service the anadromous fish and also produce power? And the state of Vermont is looking at buying the Canadian-owned dams now. So, thank you.
Yeah, I'll be very brief because I've got the over message. Yeah, there are ways of doing things now differently than they were in the past. In the past, we didn't even consider things like fish migration, spawning, the ebb and flow of the river itself. There are ways of doing that now, but for the most part, dams as such really are doing a lot more damage than just removing them. So thank you very much. We're done. I'll be around, so.